Hi everyone. It's great to be here with you. It's probably helpful for me just to say a little bit of who I am so you can place me. My name is Steve Jones. I was a student here. I arrived as an undergraduate in the early 90s. I studied biology and then hung around to do a DPhil. Here in the city of Oxford, I lead a Christian church, and we are the kind of church that's been very active in the life of the city. We started a primary school in the most multi-ethnic part of the city about 10 years ago, where about 40 different heart languages spoken by people. We love that. So delighted that Oxford is one of the most multi-ethnic cities in the South of England. We founded a housing project as well that helps people who've been homeless to get back on their feet. On Sunday, I'm going to chat to connect with some people who serve in one of the largest refugee camps in the world. So there you are, you know a few things about me and judge accordingly. This question that's put to me, angry judge versus good teacher, is Jesus really the God of the Old Testament? It's actually a really, really old question. Before we're done, we'll look at the fact that this question was being asked actively even in the end of the 1st century after Christ. Just to run into the question, it arises because there are 2 testaments in the Christian Bible, an old one and a new one. The old one comes before Jesus Christ, the new one is all about Jesus Christ, and there are all sorts of differences between the 2. So in the Old Testament, it says that certain foods are clean and others are not. In the New Testament, Jesus declares that all foods are clean. It's a really different lifestyle. The Old Testament allows for limited revenge, or as we might call it today, compensation. The New Testament forbids any kind of revenge and insists instead on forgiveness, even of one's enemies. The Old Testament story is very largely limited to one nation, the descendants of whom today we still know as the nation of Israel. And the New Testament is very much more, it's multi-ethnic, global. It declares good news for all people, with all peoples being treated in the same way. But the sharp end of the difference that's provoking today's question is that the Old Testament's picture of God is different to the picture that's given by Jesus Christ in the New Testament. And I could highlight this work just a couple of places where there seems to be a really striking distance. 1 John is the name of one of the books in the New Testament. There it says God is light, and in him there's no darkness. In the Old Testament, the prophet Isaiah, one of the great prophets of the nation of Israel, he records God saying, I form light and create darkness. Those things are not direct logical contradictions, but they're super contrasting. Another letter in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians, says various things about love. One of those is love knows no jealousy, whereas in Exodus, chapter 20, second book of the Old Testament, it says, I, the Lord. And noted there that phrase, the Lord, is the translation of one Hebrew word, which used to be often translated Jehovah, is more often these days translated Yahweh. I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God, which we're later told is nothing to do with love. So how do we make sense of that? To put the point a little bit more sharply still, many people find that the Old Testament's picture of God is just very off-putting. You may have come across this quote from Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion. When I was an undergraduate, I twice asked Richard Dawkins to supervise my studies, and both times he told me where to go. Still, I still have to quote him. He wrote, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. He is jealous and proud of it. He is petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bullying. Jesus is lovely. What about this guy in the Old Testament? What do we make of the contrast, the contradiction? So, what do Christians do with that? I want to outline to you very briefly, because I want to leave time for some interaction, some questions, 4 different approaches that Christians have taken and to some extent do still take today. And I want to declare up front that the first 3 of those 4 I believe to be inadequate. Just being frank with you. The 4th approach is the one that I'm going to recommend, and I'm not alone in that. The 4th approach is indeed what the great majority of Christian theologians today and throughout history would have recommended. So I'm just trying to pass on to you what is mainstream Christian understanding in approaching this question. So the first thing that lots of people have done over the years and do today is that, stick their head in the sand, just skip over. It's like la 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 la. Let's flip on in our Bibles to the New Testament because that's just all a bit awkward. And I've got to be honest, I lead a group of churches, quite a few people in them, and there's quite a few that would do this if they were not encouraged to do otherwise, and open the pages of the Old Testament. Hopefully that's an obviously inadequate way to address the question, because it's not addressing the question, it's just sidestepping the question. Here's the second thing. Quite a few people avoid a negative view. This picture will make sense in a second. People avoid a negative view of God in the Old Testament by instead looking down on the people of the Old Testament. They avoid a negative view of the God of the Old Testament by instead looking down on the people of the Old Testament. This is an approach that really became very popular during the Enlightenment, when, especially in Europe, where Europeans thought of themselves as civilized and really the rest of the world as savages. We know that in history to our shame. And it was quite easy then to think of ancient peoples as a kind of violent class of simpletons, as savages, who were so savage that however much truth and light God reveals to them, their darkened hearts would inevitably twist it all and mangle it towards violence and prejudice, resulting in the text that's been handed down to us. That's the second approach. I don't know how it sounds to you. It might sound quite sensible in some ways. As I said, I love living in a multi-ethnic city. I love the way in which the British, the people of, I can start getting quite excited now. The joys of being in a multi-ethnic community, but I'm going to resist going down that avenue. I find that the joy that I take in that multiculturalism pulls me right back from this, because to look back on, just because people are dead, it doesn't mean that their being from another culture is any more deserving of being looked down on. I hope that makes sense. I'm declaring to you what I understand and what I believe. You may have a different view. The third thing, this is a picture of a guy called Marcion. Well, not really. I mean, it's like a 15th century woodcut, and he lived long, long before that. Marcion, we don't know when he was born. He was active at least by 140 in the Christian era in the city of Rome. Marcion of Sinope. He took the third route, which people have taken down the centuries, and it's to minimise the significance of the Old Testament. Marcion took that to an extreme. He was, as I said, born probably around 70 years after Jesus died. He grew up in the Christian church. His father actually was a Christian bishop, but when Marcion read these Old Testament texts and the New Testament ones, not that they'd been codified in quite that way at that time, but the books existed, Marcion reasoned that the portrayals of God in the Old Testament and the New Testament were so different that the only possible explanation was that there were really two separate gods. neither of whom was the supreme God. And he reasoned that there must be some other God beyond both Jehovah of the Old Testament and also beyond Jesus of the New Testament, and this supreme God was the one that Jesus rightly revealed as Father of all, whereas Jehovah just kind of went off track somewhere and is just, again, unpleasant and not to be followed. Marcion rejected the entire Old Testament and said it should have no place in the Christian faith. He also went through the New Testament, ripping out all of the bits that seem to refer to the Old Testament. He ended up with a much smaller New Testament. Of the 29 books, he had no more than 11 and only parts of them. Which points towards the problem with Marcion's view, which is there's so much entanglement between the Old Testament and the New Testament that you can't draw a sharp line between them and just pull them apart without doing some kind of butchery to the New Testament. It was actually an African theologian called Tertullian who made the strong arguments against Marcion that ended up winning the day. And Tertullian said that in taking this approach of just dismissing the Old Testament, Marcion had effectively butchered the historical record about Jesus, which was that Jesus was in fact a Jew. And that when Jesus spoke, he is recorded as frequently quoting from the Old Testament as a reliable source of truth. When we think of it in terms of Jesus' Jewishness, we might also just wonder whether that Marcionism, that Marcionite view, is flirting with anti-Semitism. That's something also to think about. I want to suggest to you that's a third inadequate view. And the fourth thing, which will go from pictures to some text, goes like this. The fourth thing we can do, and it's what Christians have done through the centuries as they've thought about this, is pay attention to quite how the New Testament itself defines its relationship with the Old Testament. Listen to what it has to say. Now, we've clearly not got time now to look at everything that the New Testament says that has any kind of relationship to the Old Testament, but I want to give you a few headlines that are representative. The first thing is to note that the New Testament is really honest about Jesus' Jewishness. In fact, there are places where it really seriously underlines Jesus' Jewishness. Not only Luke's Gospel, as is quoted there, but Matthew's Gospel include genealogical lines showing Jesus' ethnic identity as coming from the people of Israel, as being Jew. Jesus pays the Jewish temple tax, he celebrates Passover, he's a Jew. The New Testament is very clear about that. At the same time, the New Testament clearly moves on from the law of Moses, that was the founding code of how to live, written up in the Old Testament. So the Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Galatia, says, partway through an argument about these matters, the law, meaning the law of Moses, was our guardian until Christ came, that we might be justified by faith. Could unpack that maybe in questions afterwards, what justification by faith means. The point we're drawing out here is Paul saying the law was our guardian until Christ came. Now that this faith has come, that's faith in Christ, we're no longer under a guardian. So he sees this law of Moses having been given historically for a temporary purpose, which has now been fulfilled and superseded. The thing that we see again and again in the New Testament is that Jesus is followed by people precisely because he brings something radically and amazingly new. It says there, quoting from right near the beginning of Mark's Gospel, Jesus went into a synagogue, he began to teach. How did the people respond? The people were also amazed, and they asked each other, "What is this?" It's a new teaching. And they commented also that it came with authority. It was the newness of what Jesus spoke which attracted people to him. And the New Testament, clues in the name I guess, has a lot that is distinct from the Old and is really honest about that break with what came before. And then here's another thing, just to complicate perhaps, or better enrich our understanding of the interaction, is that Jesus also refers respectfully to the Old Testament. When he teaches, he doesn't say, oh, that's a load of nonsense. He refers respectfully to the Old, but then develops it. If you've read the Sermon on the Mount, you'll have seen how he does this again and again on different topics. There's this repeated refrain where Jesus is recorded as saying, you have heard that it was said, and then he quotes something from the law of Moses, but I tell you, and then says something new. So, for example, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at someone lustfully has already committed adultery in their heart. So he's not giving up on what came before, but building on it, amending it, and saying something that is both continuous with what came before, but at the same time radically different. Elsewhere in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, you've heard it said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. That's a quote from the law of Moses. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So he's taking what's come before and changing it up. And one way then to grapple with that, I want to give you two pictures. And I hope that one or other, or even maybe both of them, will help take this complex relationship between the old and the new and just click it into something that makes sense for you. The first is a picture of a magnolia flower, actually. But it's highlighting that in the formation of a flower on a twig, there is both a continuity from one to the other and also a radical discontinuity. Every cell in the flower carries the same DNA as the twig, and it's grown out from it. There is an entire continuity, and yet, unless you were an expert botanist, you would struggle to identify from a twig alone what flower is going to bloom from it, because there's a radical discontinuity as well. It's both and that's one picture of how Christians understand the Old and the New Testaments flowing together, that we can acknowledge difference whilst not needing to cut ourselves off from the Old. Hopefully that provides a richer picture of how the two relate. The second picture, actually I would show you a picture of me and my wife. There we are, she's amazing. We've been married 25 years. This is the second picture. It's about our relationship. We've been married 25 years. Now, standing in front of you and hopefully coming across reasonably confident, you might think I'm quite an outgoing person. It's not true. I'm really quite introverted and analytical. I've just learned to present. My wife, in contrast, is an incredibly expressive person. She's an artist and quite stereotypically so in her temperament. And now, one of the things this means is that when she is just a little bit bothered by something in everyday life, she expresses that bother with the kind of energy that I would only express if I was having a full-on panic. I've just divided the room. On one side or the other, it's different personality types. Now, the thing is that for most of our marriage, and we were united for 5 years before that, so 30 years, for most of 30 years, I reacted to her every day being a bit bothered, like she was constantly panicking. Which I found that quite exhausting, and she found intensely annoying. If I had a pound every time she commented on something happening in the course of life, I said, "What are you panicking for?" And then she just cut me off at the knees, because I just disdained her by completely misreading her. Truth is, she's not abundant of anxiety. She's just a lot more expressive than me. And I've had to learn. I'm a slow learner. She's forgiven me. I hope you can forgive me too. The point is this. If you want to understand someone, you really need to take time to learn their inner workings. What you immediately see when you meet someone is often quite inaccurate perception of what's really going on for them. And so when we come to this question of the apparent mismatch between what Jesus is like and things that we discover in the Old Testament, we might ask ourselves, how is it possible that God might be both loving and at the same time a cosmic arbiter of justice who includes death in his list of potential punishments for evil? How on earth can those fit together? You might feel much like Marcion did. Though he was brought up in the Christian church, he saw these two things and I cannot see how that holds together. The Christian approach, taken through the centuries, has been to say it takes time to get to know God as a person. There's a richness in his being which defies simple reduction to a few bullet points, but is explored through a relationship with him. And so I want to finish with a simple statement of good news. The Christian good news is that Jesus reveals God as a person who actually wants to be known. He doesn't want to remain a mystery beyond any capacity for us to relate to him. He's always going to have things going on that are beyond our understanding, because we're finite, and for God to truly be God, there's always going to be things about him that are beyond us. And yet, in Jesus Christ, the God of all comes down to reduce himself into the form that we can most relate to. Another human being, out of his determined passion precisely to form a relationship with people. I can tell you lots of stories of people who've discovered that God is profoundly interested in a relationship with them, even to their surprise. I'll tell you just one. My friend Abu, he grew up in Uganda, where he grew up in a Muslim family, as it happens, he went and trained at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which is some would describe it as it's equivalent to like Oxford in the Middle East, in the Islamic world. He became an imam and returned to Kampala, where he served his faith community, not least by leading prayers in the mosque where he served. One day, leading prayers in the mosque in Kampala, he heard what seemed to him to be an audible voice saying, "I am Jesus Christ, follow me." And so he did what he knew was right to do, which is he prayed a prayer of defense against satanic deception to deal with it, this moment that he had, the apparent attack he was facing. And when, immediately following that, he again heard what seemed to him to be an audible voice saying, "I am Christ, follow me," in that moment, it seemed to him as clear as day that this voice was true. And he walked out of the mosque and down the road and into a church and said, "I need to follow Jesus because he's reached out to me." There are myriad stories of all different kinds of how people have discovered that God, in Jesus Christ, is interested in a relationship, which means he's interested in being known. So there's an invitation there, not only to address this matter intellectually, but to address it holistically, and to ask ourselves the question, if we could have that relationship in which we would discover a personality over time, would we want it? Or is this merely an intellectual pursuit? So we're just trying to square something up logically and move on?
Or is there a longing in our hearts, a seeking after a relationship with the one who made us and who's revealed himself in Christ Jesus? If that's the case, then one of the many wonderful things that Jesus is recorded as saying is that if you seek, you will find. If you seek, you will find. And he's inviting people who are wondering whether maybe it's worth seeking him, that it totally is. And that's been my story as well. But I'd love not just to keep talking. You've already listened to me for a while, and I'm sure you've got your own reflections on this topic. It would be great to hear those, and that will continue to enrich our understanding